just to introduce us before we really get started, I'm Jennifer Curley, President and CEO of Curley Company, and I'm also publisher of the Association 100. And I'm here to moderate this conversation we're going to have today with Neil Seeman. And Neil, let me just give your title because I love it. He is the founder, chief executive officer, chief privacy officer, and chairman of RIWI Corporation. What I think is so fabulous about your bio is that you're also a globally recognized researcher in the field of infodemiology. Infodemiology, I'm going to say that a few times. I had to practice it today. It's obviously under the umbrella of internet research and led you to develop the core technology of RIWI. When you started your research, the other thing I found so fascinating, it was to track the H1N1 virus in order to understand how different online populations behave and react during a pandemic. And obviously, I guess that really comes in handy now with everything we're dealing with. So really excited for this conversation today. And the title of it is really talking about instrument error in the 2020 elections. We saw a lot of coverage right after the election day about how traditional polls are dead. And I think that's where I want to start the conversation today and really begin with that question, Neil. So talk to us about that. Are traditional polls dead as a predictor for US elections?
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'd say there's two elements here that are dying or in a state of extreme metamorphosis. So various elements of the art craft of polling are dying and have been dying for some time. And here I'm talking about things like reweighting, oversampling, Bayesian modeling, all these things that try to overweight non-college educated white men, correcting for education, as was tried in 2020 to correct for 2016. And other things about polling will improve, like improving question design. But the more fundamental thing, which is dying, and again has been dying for some time and may in fact be dead, is the instrument upon which this art craft relies. Instrument being voter file databases, panel-based sampling, telephone vote databases upon which you can make these inferences, these assumptions. And that foundational instrument has now been revealed as non-random and erroneous and flawed.
Myself, because the dog was barking. Welcome to doing a webinar during pandemic times. So could you talk about how the polls were wrong and what your data showed at RIWI in contrast?
Yeah, thank you. So, big picture, we know the polls were wrong by having predicted a big blue wave, right? And the big second, probably bigger error was predicting that with an utter lack of humility. So sort of continued certainty over the fact that there would be a big blue wave. And of course, there were battleground polling gaffes as well, as we're all familiar. The best data aggregators of pollsters found an underrepresentation of the president's vote in a lot of battleground states, serious gaffes with respect to Wisconsin and Florida in particular. But it's really this sort of lack of humility. And what RIWI found, and others did too, I should say this, but what RIWI found from the beginning, early September, is that things were really close. Clearly, there was an undetected Trump vote out there. And we tested this hypothesis every day with a new random cohort of Americans, most of whom on the RIWI machine are quiet voices, people who don't traditionally answer surveys, people who do not scream on social media. And this was the way we were able to get a really clean signal on the prediction that things would be really close. And we certainly knew that Florida and New Hampshire were in President Trump's column quite early on.
Yeah. So talk about that for a minute. Like, let's drill on that idea. So you kind of predicted this was happening. You saw this coming. What was your biggest surprise on election day? Like, when you were kind of getting through that night and the next morning, what was your biggest surprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a few a few surprises. The first surprise was that everybody was, well, at least the many in the mainstream media and others were so surprised. There were a lot of us that were tracking us, kind of, tracking this kind of data nerds, often people in the financial services sector that were looking at a variety of other factors in the market that would indicate that things were quite close. The second thing was just uh, there was a bit of a surprise to me with respect to Georgia. This was one state that we did feel, but Georgia and Arizona both were the two states that we felt were lean Trump or strong lean Trump. And yet, of course, there's a very narrow margin with respect to those states. Um, the the biggest thing that surprised me, I think, was the conversation that has happened afterwards. And the conversation has been a lot about things that the pollsters did wrong or the mainstream media did wrong. Uh, I feel there's been a missing conversation about social media in particular. And to the extent that there's been a missing conversation about social media, I feel that we're not actually speaking about the elephant in the room of social media. There's some really low cost, high return on investment ideas I think a lot of people have that can increase faith in technology around how we receive information online.
Yeah, that's great. Um, can we go back to you talked about a little bit, you didn't call it this, but the shy Trump voter, we've been hearing a lot about that in the media. Can you tell that story a little bit further about what that really was and what you saw on your end and how you would describe that?
Sure. I should say, by the way, I misspoke. I think I meant North Carolina, not New Hampshire, with respect
Oh,
to the early signal. Um, uh, so then we're clearly in President Trump's column. The shy Trump voter, we prefer to call them the undetected Trump voter, because to suggest that they're shy is sort of a bit of a misnomer. Essentially, these are people who feel uncomfortable for any number of reasons, telling a pollster, a regular pollster, or even during an exit poll about their true feelings, either for reasons of social desirability bias or really just for reasons of discomfort. We all know in the current age that when you share personal data, whether on the telephone, whether online, that data, even if it's de-anonymized during a period of time, can be re-identified to you and it can live with you for life. So this is the undetected Trump voter. And what happened in this election was that the instruments, the voter file databases, the panels, even when you combined these various instruments, were not revealing the changing Trump coalition. And we saw that in the end result, right? We saw that with the African-American vote, the Latino vote changing. Sort of this is, so although the issue around the undetected Trump voter is really important, what's I think more important is recognizing that the instrument itself needs to address its foundational problems, and one of which is that it's not able to glean quiet voices.
yeah. Is this a new phenomena? So obviously you had data in 2016 that validated this. Is this something that's come to us recently? Or are people more reluctant to share than they used to be? Or is it because of technology? Or what do you kind of attribute that to?
Well, we see this phenomena around the world. I sort of in 2016, that was a thunderclap in America. But what we're finding is that, again, and it really does have to do, in my opinion, with an increasing awareness of the of issues around personally identifiable data. So we stopped counting at around 1.6 billion interviewees in 229 countries and territories around the world from whom we've collected opinion data, video ad test reaction data on a continuous basis without ever collecting personally identifiable data. And I think as this growing recognition of the importance of privacy and the growing recognition that your identity can and your views and opinions can be put at risk, I do believe that that has something to do with this phenomenon that we see today, but we've seen for a number of years coming.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so what can we do, I mean, to make sure we have better indicators for the next election? What's the solution here? Obviously, you have amazing technology, but talk to us a little bit about what that solution might look like.
Thanks. I mean, I think what we're going to see in the coming elections increasingly is what we've seen already and that's an increasing role of the machine and a decreasing role of humans. So in the prediction. So and ABC is kind of illustrative of this. I mean, they had their traditional polling, which was off, but then they had their website where people could come and predictors could actually predict the outcome. And that was more precise. And you're going to see a lot more AI machines, tools like RIWI machine learning tools, which just present the data. At the same time, the role of pollsters is going to change such that they specialize in what they're amazing at, which is question design. I think you're going to see increasing depersonalization of questions. So the pollsters that did better tended to be ones who asked about how friends and neighbors, what we did, ask about how people in your state are going to vote, such that you can depersonalize, get away from that bias that can be introduced. And then I think we're also going to see more humility in the process. I think that that's important. And again, I do believe, however, that we have an information environment that does need to be addressed with respect to social media. And very briefly here, I would just suggest that there needs to be a recognition that social media tools or digital media marketplaces do not, and we know this to be a fact, do not have sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence algorithms to clean up the nonsense, COVID-related, other, on social media that's propagated. Once it's on, it's too late. And I think the public is increasingly recognizing that. That was a problem in this election. It's much more of a problem with respect to COVID. But I want to put that out there as a discussion that I think really needs to be had.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. All right, so what's next in the U.S. elections? Georgia Senate race. Are you guys involved there? Are you planning to do any kind of research there?
Well, thanks. I mean, Jennifer, as you know, we were dragged into political polling by our finance clients who were highly skeptical in both in 2016 and 2018 and today and in other events around the world that we've been involved in with respect to traditional polling. So if our finance clients bring us into Georgia, we'll consider it. Georgia is interesting with President Trump not being on the ballot. I'm not sure the extent to which the undetected Trump voter will be a factor. Of course, there's our own data and other data to suggest that it's going to be an uphill battle for the Democratic candidates. But putting all of that aside, there's also, and I'm not a political scientist, but there is a growing sort of interesting consensus that things are settled now, that independent of whether or not there's an additional 2 more Senate seats in the Republican camp, that President-elect Biden is constrained by the more progressive wing of his party. So there may not be, I don't know this yet, certainly we have people talking to us about it, but there may not be as much demand from our finance clients for investigating Georgia, but to be determined.
Okay, well, if you do it, I want to hear all about it. So we'll have to have a phone call and to discuss. So thank you. I'm going to move off the elections and pivot off the elections for just a minute. And we can we'll take questions for those of you who are watching live. We're happy to take questions at the end. So just know that that's coming. But I want to just maybe take a minute and have you talk about RIWI's technology and what makes it different. Really kind of get into it for me for a minute and explain how it works and why it's different than traditional polls.
Yeah, sure. I mean, RIWI stands for Real-Time Interactive Worldwide Intelligence. It operates off the architecture of the internet. It's our mechanism of action is referred to as random domain intercept technology, such that anyone browsing on any web-enabled device anywhere in the world can stumble upon or be RIWI'd when they encounter a vacant, lapsed domain that no longer is commercially active when they're browsing on digital content. And that then invites them to participate in a survey on a real registered domain. We've been doing this for many, many years now with the university sector, with the government sector, with the business sector in every country and region of the world except for North Korea. And we get this continuous read on people's opinions. We do not collect personally identifiable information. We get a staggering proportion of people who are non-habitual survey respondents. So in the current election cycle, for example, about 2/3 of the over 100,000 American forecasters were people who had not answered an election survey in the past year, and many of them, I think over 50%, had never answered an election survey of any kind. So RIWI's getting that non-habitual survey taker, the so-called quiet voices in public health, which is my background. We call them underrepresented groups. So these are some of the important differentiators for RIWI, which is often referred to as the real wisdom of the online crowds, which then uses machine learning to map that data to ensure that it's a beautiful mirror image map of the web using population in any region. And then it's also mapped on to census and can be potentially integrated with other data sets to get additional signals of value, whether it's about emerging violent extremism or vaccine hesitancy or front-running official economic indicators, as we do in various parts of the world.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. So you mentioned a little bit about your customers. Can you talk about who's using your data, who your customers are, kind of what they're doing with that and how it's influencing their decisions?
So our customers are customers who care about the truth, no matter how ugly or disquieting that truth may be. So for example, if you're a corporate that really wants to understand whether your brand is suffering, you come to RIWI. And part of the challenge with brand audit tracking, for example, is that it often tells you what you want to hear, as opposed to what is true. Our customers tend to be extremely data sophisticated. They tend to be customers either in the government sector, the university sector, who want to understand socially sensitive issues. So for example, we are the largest data collector of the changing attitudes toward LGBTQ communities in about 77 countries of the world. We look at a whole range of issues related to gender-related issues, violence towards women, and a range of just what's often referred to in Army nomenclature as sort of command climate issues. So how do individual norms affect your personal attitudes, which are changeable over time and are particularly relevant right now in the era of COVID.
Mhm. Can you, we talked a little bit about what surprised you most with the election, but it struck me in listening to you just now, you probably get surprised maybe by a lot of things. Are there other times when you've been doing this kind of research where something you found a trend or something that you're going, whoa, or your client was really surprised, something that's not election related that struck you as something that was distinctive or different than you would have expected?
Yeah, it really began at the very beginning. So as you rightly pointed out, we got started originally out of a research unit that I used to run, affiliated with the University of Toronto, looking at H1N1. And we were looking at knowledge, sort of basic health literacy. and basic hygiene literacy. And what we learned is that it wasn't positively correlated with your level of education, for example. So there were places in the world that were actually where people were quite poor, and they didn't have much education at all, but they were vastly more educated about hand hygiene, about the basic etiology of disease than others who had professional degrees from amazing universities, right? So that was one surprise, and so much of RIWI is actually about surprises, and then you get inured to the surprises, which is kind of interesting, and then you get surprised by other people's lack of surprise, which is actually what happened in this latest election. I must say, for example, what happened in this latest election, not just myself, but many people were just spending great late nights trying to figure out why the public media polls were wrong. We knew they were wrong, but we couldn't figure out why they were so wrong. And it was really quite confounding to us. So in any event, we have many surprises. I'll give you another surprise. Digital advertising, okay? So there's sort of this idea, and this relates to elections too, there's this idea that digital messages or message campaigns have an impact. Many times, or most of the time, they have no impact. They have zero. And many times they actually have a negative consequence. And so sometimes you're really surprised by a digital ad that worked. It was actually, I remember one, we did the Senate, the 2018 Senate, and there was one digital ad in Montana, which was extraordinarily powerful and really did turn the dial on public sentiment, whereas others that were hard-hitting, supposed negative ads that would change the dial had no effect.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, you had kind of talked about some of the public health issues, and obviously the number one thing on everyone's mind right now is COVID-19. And I know you've done some research on vaccines and people's willingness to actually take a vaccine. Or so could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing there as we pivot into this next stage of COVID-19 in the vaccine, and how you think that might play out based on the sentiment that you've seen?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jennifer. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how important this topic is, vaccine hesitancy. I don't particularly like that term for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, we've been tracking that, working on that in 11 countries. We co-presented some work with my colleagues at Emory University. In the United States, during the summer, we found vaccine hesitancy pretty strong at about 36% in America. We also found no differentiation. This is not a pandemic that discriminates as to whether you're a blue state or a red state, nor does vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy is an attitude, a sentiment that is informed by a complex dynamic suite of variables. And of course, those data are taken before we've seen these wonderful, these high efficacy data from the two drugs that have advanced the furthest, and then today, very excitingly, the data in the Lancet for the Oxford AstraZeneca trial, which is suggesting high efficacy among elderly patients. So what we need to do with respect to this is we need to measure changing attitudes toward vaccine hesitancy, hotspots, how that's changing as the vaccine gets distributed, and what sorts of triggers, whether they're healthcare workers in your neighborhood, whether they're your friends, what sorts of triggers make you more willing to take the vaccine, more willing to take precautions. And so these are some of the things that we're looking at with respect to COVID. We also are looking at a variety of public health economic issues, and you really can't disentangle the two. Okay, so you know, as we know, so much about COVID affects one's willingness to go to work, one's willingness to participate meaningfully in the economy. And so these are all things that we're measuring on a high frequency basis in different parts of the world that are important to understanding both the course of the pandemic and the course of the resilience of the economy.
That's really great. You know, one thing struck me as you were talking, I'm in the communications business. And so a lot of times for our clients, we want to measure sentiment before we do something. We want to measure sentiment after to see if the communications we've been doing moves the needle at all. And so it sounds like that's something you are working on when it comes to the vaccine issue specifically, but it's something that you do as well.
Yeah, I mean, issue campaigns are really interesting. Of course, you can do it on a continuous basis to see whether or not the needle is moved. And then what's really cool about measuring impact around a campaign for a corporate is by looking at how it's been done in other jurisdictions of the world. So you can take, essentially, if you're doing whether market entry analysis or you're trying to measure the efficacy of a digital message, you can learn from other similar jurisdictions. And so that's a way in which RIWI has been used in situations like that.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a couple of questions into the chat here, so I'm going to turn to a couple of those, and then I've still got a couple of my own. So Annette has asked us, can you explain why the individuals that answer RIWI surveys are willing to trust you and actually engage? I understand that they don't have to disclose name or register, but don't they suspect you'll be able to know who they are anyway?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've studied this for 12 years, and the results are really quite surprising. So people answer RIWI surveys for a wide range of reasons, and we've run calibration tests with household name research companies that we work with that license our technology, and sometimes they answer it because they enjoy surveys. Sometimes in different parts of the world, they want to express their voice. Sometimes they're comforted by the fact that no data are being collected. Sometimes they see emblazoned the logo of an eminent university that we work with. So they're comforted in that respect. But nonetheless, the questioner is well taken. That's always a concern, right? That someone could potentially be concerned about their privacy. So that's why question design is really important in depersonalizing the question. But yes, I mean, the mere fact that we do not ask for your email, the mere fact that that people are not answering for the sole purpose of getting rewards or incentives, the mere fact that we're not an email access panel that registers as spam or alerts you in some malware type situation. These are all things that mitigate these kinds of biases that we always have to be attuned to. And then at the same time, we have a variety of tools to ensure that anomalous type responses get weeded out of the response string.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. We have an anonymous question here that says, basically, it's been exciting to see the company grow over the last year. Can you comment on any new sales prospects? I kind of think that leads towards sales, customers and some of the things we've already talked about, but do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I mean, I'm always, of course, we are a public company, so certainly I can't say anything inappropriate, but what I can say is that what we are doing is increasingly China focused and increasing COVID, right? So as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, there's no reason for me to doubt this, is that we are the biggest data collector across China on a continuous high frequency basis. We, of course, are the only ones that collect data across rural and urban China on a continuous basis. And the clients that are increasingly care about us want to understand the Chinese consumer. So much of what's happening with US-based multinationals or US equities is so dependent on the Chinese consumer. And whether this is coffee, whether this is video game consoles, whether it's higher education, all of these markets are affected by that. So to the extent of sales prospects, I would just emphasize that this is a growing area of our business from a geographical perspective, as we see China, from a resilience perspective and an economic directionality perspective, looking pretty good and going back to pre-COVID levels. At the same time, we're seeing from China some things we can learn potentially around COVID. There is, interestingly enough, change in China. There was a great deal of vaccine hesitancy in China that we tracked and we produced in the summer, and yet now that has changed. Why has it changed? That's really interesting. There is a great deal of trust in the public health infrastructure in China. That's changed. Why is that? I mean, one of the challenges in this pandemic, pandemic coming from the Greek pandemos, that it is global, is that we aren't, let's just say, investing enough effort in trying to learn from other countries. And so that is one of the areas in which I'm both mesmerized by intellectually, but it also generates a great deal of customer interest as well.
Yeah, thank you. We've got another question. This is from, wait, hold on a second. I've got two more questions actually coming into the chat here. So the first one's from Ron. And the question is, did your model anticipate the historic voter turnout? Your thoughts on the high levels on both sides?
Yeah, so we definitely saw, look, strong enthusiasm on both sides, this was not unique to us. What was interesting, of course, is that clearly we saw a stronger enthusiasm on the Trump side, but in terms of the historic turnout, no. I mean, we could not have predicted the actual numbers. I mean, that would, that takes guesswork. But our model is such that it doesn't rely on the magnitude of the vote, because we're using forecasters, we're using predictors. But the short answer is we certainly did not predict the numbers, the uptake of the mail-in ballot to the extent that it was successful in engaging people to that degree.
Yeah, so enthusiasm, but certainly don't know about the rest. Next question is from Kenneth, and he says, how do respondents get on RIWI? How does RIWI get those folks to respond, and how many do?
Yeah, thanks. So RIWI is the only inbound mechanism in the world. So most all survey mechanisms other than RIWI that I'm familiar with are outbound, right? You get a telephone call, you get an email. So with RIWI, you stumble in, you get RIWI'd as you're randomly navigating the web, and you accidentally get interrupted. Some form of interruption is necessary in order to have that random mechanism of action. So that's how you stumble upon a RIWI survey when you meet these vacant domains. I think the question was about the percentage of people that respond. Globally, on average, we have a response rate in terms of full completion globally, because it varies enormously by country, of about 10% on a 14-question instrument. That being said, in our academic publications, it's much higher than that, because we calculate it based on the percentage of people who opt in and then complete. It's lesser in America, no doubt. It's higher than other traditional models like the telephone intercept.
Yeah. I have another question here from Vishal, and this one might require you to have a magic 8-ball versus the sentiment data. But his question, which I love, is, in your opinion, will Trump run in 2024?
Oh goodness, I'm sorry, I cannot predict that. What I can say though, and this is, I'm just saying this as a observer of data, is that what was quite remarkable about this election on our data and other data is that there was quite strong support for a range of elements of President Trump's platform and public policies. People talk about the nature of his behavior and such, but that was quite interesting, and I do believe it potentially can give, let's just say, the Trump coalition. I'm not talking about President Trump himself, but the president's coalition some enthusiasm about the future going forward. So I found that interesting.
Yeah. Another question from an anonymous attendee. It says, you mentioned that your clients are sophisticated data users. That being the case, how much are you investing in leading edge data visualization? As an example, the Financial Times, was a newspaper focused on very discerning audiences, has invested heavily. The reasoning is that seeing the data differently is changing the way they understand the story and how they report.
Oh, I'm a huge believer in data visualization and the evolution of data visualization, which is changing very fast. So we personally, yes, we are investing in mapping visualization. Our clients do see that, and we have topographical maps and different ways of digesting the data. Some clients just love the raw data because they have their own visualization platform. They don't actually like it curated. So we're, from a business perspective, we're very responsive to client needs as they invest in those needs. I should say there's something exciting afoot from a public sort of just like that. We're working with a variety of very sophisticated media on a mental health topic that will be visualized in media, and I'm personally very committed to mental health. Our company is, and so this is something that we're going to be rolling out in conjunction with media that are very sophisticated in terms of not only digital but also a video. I think video visualizations are very powerful for digesting information.
Yeah, that's great. So John is asking next, how do the polling companies know when the answers are being fabricated?
So traditional polling companies that rely on panels are variable, and some of them have highly sophisticated tools that detect straight line voting. We can do that too, of course. We can detect anomalous voting patterns. Someone says they've used they say they've never heard of Coca-Cola, for example, and they should have. And there's a variety of other indicia that suggest that maybe they're not answering truthfully. So you can get at that. The challenge, of course, is that one of the biggest dirty hidden secrets, of course, of traditional polling is that there's a lot of click fraud. There's a lot of bots that enter into the equation. So we do an enormous amount of work on simply things like validation that it's actually a human user. And these are things that other companies do as well.
Yeah. So I want to kind of close today. I'm going to take another question from the feed, but I also had a last question myself, and I think they go hand in hand. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's next for RIWI, but really talk about China a little bit. You've talked about it a lot today. Obviously, I think we're all really interested in what you're seeing there. I'm going to read the question and then just ask you to kind of pivot off of that and talk a little bit about what's happening in the future for RIWI too. So the question is from, let's see, I can't see who wrote the question, but I'm going to just read it anyway. It says, what does your research in China actually tell you about attitudes there? Have you asked about Chinese views on Japan, US, etc.? And are they optimistic about the future of China? So I think that, it's what are you seeing so far, and kind of, what are you looking to see as RIWI continues to evolve and look at that market?
Yeah, thanks. So we're looking at a wide range of things in China, and we have an increasing appetite for ingesting new data in respect of Chinese attitudes and behaviors. So sector-based employment is really interesting to us. The degree to which the technology sector is rising. What we are seeing, and it was reported in Chinese media as well as elsewhere, is an increasing educational nationalism. So a resistance toward American higher education. And that's important because American higher education, of course, would often rely on Chinese students, whether virtually or in person. So that's an interesting sector to watch. We are seeing a buoyancy of the Chinese consumer. We are seeing a variety of data to support the economic resilience of China.
That's great. Well, this is wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time today to have this conversation. Obviously, look forward to hearing so much more from you in the coming weeks and months. I mean, these issues are just top of mind, and you are at the center of so many interesting things, especially on the vaccine issue. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that from you. So thank you very much for today, and we'll look forward to hearing more in the future.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And again, congratulations, Woman of the Year. Much, much, much deserved.
Thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate it.
Take care. Take care. Be well. Thank you.